even at that time it was a really old city. And no one knows when it was first built, but today it's well over 3,000 years old. And it's a place for pilgrims to go visit. Jewish and Christian and Muslim pilgrims go visit. About 1,000 years before Jesus was born, King David took the city and made it his own. And it was there that his son, King Solomon, built the first temple. The temple was burned down by the Babylonians, who took many people who lived in Jerusalem into exile. And when they returned, the temple was rebuilt again. And it was rebuilt again and expanded by King Herod by the time Jesus was born. Here are the walls of the city. The walls there are really high, much higher than walls here.
Those walls people can step over easily. Now you're good at this.
That's the right one.
Here.
Thank you.
And yours outside the walls.
This one. Here is the temple. And here is where the upper room was, as much as anyone can tell. And the Roman fortress of Antonio is up there near the temple. And here's Herod's palace. The Kidron Valley, I walked through this. It was just like walking up and down. Kidron Valley runs along the side of the city, and some say there might have been a bridge there that connected the city to the Mount of Olives, but others aren't so sure. And this is where the Garden of Gethsemane is, that place that I went to that had the really old trees in it.
Is this the one where
And that's where it still is today.
Show the picture of the really, really deep canyons and the city on the cliffside?
No, that was like out in the desert. Here is Golgotha, the place of the skull where Jesus died on the cross for us. Now Jesus went into Jerusalem many times, even as a baby and as a boy. And once the mother Mary and the father Joseph found him in the temple talking to the priests. This story is about the last time Jesus went to Jerusalem. We remember it every year during the week called Holy Week. Jesus and the 12 came from Galilee along the twisting Jordan River to Jericho. He healed the blind Bartimaeus and had supper there with Zacchaeus. When they left Jericho, they crossed the low desert and began to climb up towards the city. Perhaps Jesus and his disciples spent the Sabbath at rest in Bethany, which is over here somewhere. On Sunday, Jesus sent 2 of the disciples ahead to borrow a donkey, and he rode into the donkey into the city, probably through a southern gate, down here somewhere, and made his way along the pilgrim route through the oldest part of the city up towards the Temple Mount. Some people noticed this and they thought he might be the Messiah, so they cut palm branches and waved them. And they threw their coats on the ground and called out, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Others were opening their shops, because these roads are little narrow shopways. Remember I saw a video of me walking through a little narrow place with shops? That's what they were like, often with coverings over them. Fruit and cheese and wine and bread were being set out on the rough wooden tables to sell. Jesus and the 12 climbed up the limestone slabs that made a street of steps until they came to an open area. They must have left the donkey there and decided to enter the temple to pray. Perhaps they went in through the double gate. They could have also gone on up the outside steps, but they could not go in the triple gate because that was just for priests. When they reached the Temple Mount, they came out onto the broad open courtyard and crossed it to enter the temple to pray. When their prayers were finished, they left the Temple Mount and went outside the city wall all the way down again and crossed Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives to spend the night. And that's where they spent the night each week. On Monday morning, Jesus came back in and began to teach in the temple again. He taught where the other rabbis were teaching, in the court of the Gentiles. And that evening, they went back to the Mount of Olives to sleep again. On Tuesday, they came up the stairs inside the Temple Mount and into the royal portico where the Sanhedrin met at the far end. And the money changers and the merchants were there. And Jesus became angry at the buying and selling in such a holy place. And he turned over the tables for money changing and upset those selling birds in little cages and other animals for sacrifices. He called for the people to keep the temple as a place of prayer. The guards began to watch him carefully, and they also noticed how the crowds were listening to him and were growing. Each night, he went outside the city wall and went over to the Mount of Olives. And the people watched them cross the Kidron Valley again and again and began to talk about the legend that the Mount of Olives was where the Messiah was to come down from heaven and lead an army of angels to drive away the Roman soldiers. On Wednesday, the crowds listening to him grew larger and the guards became worried and they began to think about how to arrest him. That evening, Jesus and the 12 crossed over to the Mount of Olives once more. Perhaps as the sun set, Jesus sat on the hillside over here, across from the temple with Peter and Andrew and James and John. They asked him privately what was going to happen. On Thursday, the guards were ready to take Jesus, but he did not go to the Temple Mount that day. The disciples asked Jesus where they would keep the Passover, and he told them to go into the city and look for a man carrying a water jar. Do you remember I said that in my video? He would show them. And when evening came, they crossed the Kidron Valley and went into the city to the appointed house. They climbed up the stairs to an upper room and had their Last Supper together. And after they had everything that they wanted to eat, Jesus shared the bread and the wine with them and said that he would always be with them, especially in the bread and the wine. They did not understand what he meant, but they would not forget. He also told them to love one another, and he showed them how to care for each other by washing their feet. After that, Judas hurried away into the darkness of the city. The rest went back to the Mount of Olives, and now it was late, and you could barely see the lights of Jerusalem across the way. Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray while the disciples fell asleep. When Jesus came back from his prayers, the soldiers from the temple came out of the darkness and took him away. Judas was with them and showed Jesus to them. They took him back into the city and finally to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. There the priests asked him questions and he did not answer. Finally, the high priest tore his robes and cried out, "Blasphemy!" And they convicted Jesus of the crime of pretending to be God. After that, the temple guards probably took Jesus to a jail in the Roman fortress of Antonia. On Friday morning, Jesus was brought to Pilate, the Roman governor, and Pilate asked Jesus questions. "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replied, "You have said so," but had nothing else to say. When Jesus would not answer, Pilate sent him to Herod, a son of Herod the Great, who built the temple and had died about 34 years before. And Herod grew tired of him and sent him back to Pilate at the fortress of Antonia. Pilate then showed Jesus to the crowd, and there was a tradition to release a prisoner at the time of Passover. Pilate asked the crowd if he should release Jesus or Barabbas, and the crowd shouted, "Barabbas, release Barabbas."
Barabbas.
Someone else. The soldiers prepared Jesus to be crucified. They then took him through the streets to Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, where they hung him on the cross and he died. And people still walk along these streets today to remember Jesus and pray. Today they moved from a school where the Roman fortress used to be along the Via del Rosa, the Street of Sadness, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. After Jesus died, the disciples took him down from the cross and placed him in a tomb given to him by Joseph of Arimathea. A great stone was rolled in front of the opening to close it like a locked door. On Saturday, everything was quiet. On Sunday, the women had the courage to go to the tomb just to be close to Jesus. When they got there, they found that the stone had been rolled away and discovered that somehow he was still with them as he's with us today. Now, which part of this story did you like best?
I liked when he went to the garden. And he prayed.
Milty, what do you like best?
I like the part. It's actually something about it. I like how it's sounds a bit like a survival. Wait a minute, what is it called?
Survival.
No, Bibles. No, what is it called? Survival. Sorry. Yes. So I like how it's survival story.
A Bible story?
Our Bible, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
What did you like about it?
I think it's funny how the heads go here, 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 here. No, here.
Yeah, they kept going back and forth.
Here. Yeah, and it's probably quite annoying for Jesus because he had to walk the whole way.
Well, I mean, I've walked that, and that was, kind of like walking from here to down to the shop. Kind of, it's not that far, but it's not a huge area. It's like probably only a kilometre or so across this. What do you think?
I've got another.
Where are the gates to the city?
Well, there's a few gates actually.
Each one of these.
Yeah, there's lots of
actually
different gates. So when I stayed there, I think I was just outside this gate, which was the Damascus gate.
So you got to visit the skull place, right?
Oh yeah,
I don't know, I wasn't very good at exactly where everything was. Maybe, I don't know. Yes, yeah.
I also like how it's kind of a story. Jesus was a human being, so it happens. You go through tough times. Eventually, you pass away. Yeah.
What do you think is important about this story?